Welcome. Welcome. Tonight we have a couple, married couple and co-authors of, in this case, they're going to be talking about the subject of their book, A Square Meal, A Culinary History of the Great Depression, Jane Ziegelman and Andrew Coe. And when I first looked at this book and read it, embarked on reading it, I thought it was going to be foods invented when nobody could afford anything but beans and white bread. And it turned out to be a fascinating cultural and social history and political and economic history of the period, really from World War I through the end of World War II, much more than just food and much more than just the Depression, though it certainly covered that beautifully. But I was fascinated, for example, that they talked about the rations in World War I, and Herbert Hoover was the great hero in America. He was running food programs. He was a brilliant administrator, and American troops in Europe on the battlefields got 1.25 pounds of meat a day ration, which was more than most of us get now. And amazing, just what they were really well fed. They were fed 5,000 calories a day, and on what was at least then thought as a balanced diet, which would make them into better soldiers. Anyway, they have written a number of different things. And many of you will remember Jenny 8 Lee, who a New York Times correspondent who came here maybe 7 or 8 years ago, and spoke about the food of the Chinese diaspora and talked about her search for the origin of General Tso's chicken. And it turns out that Andrew was involved with that, I guess both of you and Andrew, and they made a film, which I have not seen, about the search for General Tso's chicken, which ended rather badly. And some of you may remember that. But so we've had a little collaboration there between the present speaker, one of the present speakers, and one we had who was really entertaining and terrific years ago. Jane also is the head of the food program at the Tenement Museum in New York, and if any of you have not made it there, it's really worth going and seeing that remarkable museum. I just wanted to read one thing because there's been a tremendous amount of renewed interest in the Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt over the last 2 years, and one of the things that's come out in that is how dreadful the food was in the White House. And they speak about that, and I just wanted to read a quote, and I cleared with them that they're not planning to quote this, so I will. Dinner guests, appalled by the consistently miserable cooking they encountered at the White House table, recorded their gastronomic misadventures. Senator Hiram Johnson described a meal with FDR that included indifferent chowder followed by some mutton served in slices already cut, which had become almost cold, with peas that were none too palatable. When Ernest Hemingway was invited to dine at the White House in 1937, he was warned to expect the worst. Still, he was taken aback by the rainwater soup and rubber squab. Anyway, so, and the president, as they point out, loved really great food, but he was a good husband, and he wanted to set the right example. So I will set the right example by inviting our guests up to talk to us about the food of the Depression.
Here. Thank you. Sam, am I working here? Can you hear me? Jane will be the one talking about FDR and his food, so you'll just have to wait a little bit. I am going to start appropriately in the mid-1920s, just before Thanksgiving. In 1925, a Thanksgiving Day editorial in the Washington Post began, "The American people will sit down today to a bountiful meal and give thanks to the Almighty for their blessings. The country is overflowing with food, and no one need go hungry. Peace prevails. There is plenty of work for all at good wages. No scourge threatens, and there is no one to make Americans afraid. The United States was then in the midst of an unprecedented economic expansion, one that mainstream economists believe could continue for years or even decades. In 1928, whoops, oh no, I pressed the wrong button. Whoops. There we go. In 1928, when he accepted the Republican Party's nomination for the presidency, Herbert Hoover boasted, "We in America today are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before in the history of the land." His campaign promised a chicken for every pot and a car for every backyard to boot. Voters believed him. The man who had fed millions of starving Belgians and Frenchmen during the war and rescued thousands of Americans in the aftermath of the 1927 Mississippi flood could surely handle any crisis that might arise. 7 months after Hoover's inauguration, the stock market crashed, losing almost half its value in a few short weeks. President Hoover told the American people that the downturn would be brief, lasting maybe a few months. The American economy was fundamentally strong, he said. People just needed to stop being pessimistic and start investing again. Privately, he knew that the problem was far more serious. Early in 1930, the economy fell into a deflationary spiral. As sales tumbled, many companies fired workers to reduce cost. The ripple effects were felt in nearly every corner of American society, including on the nation's dinner tables. Even though food prices were dropping, wages were falling more quickly, so families suddenly couldn't afford a square meal. In the context of America in 1930, that still meant meat and potatoes, bread and butter, maybe a vegetable or pickles, coffee, and pie or cake for dessert. Hoover wasn't concerned about the first outward signs of suffering that appeared, bread lines in big cities like New York. The crisis was only temporary, he stated. Jobs would return by summer. In any case, local relief was the job of cities and states, not the federal government. That summer, however, he was forced to respond to a much bigger crisis unfolding in the South. A devastating drought hit the Mississippi Delta, the heart of the nation's cotton belt, and then expanded north and east into Appalachia. Big city journalists who traveled through the region were shocked at the poverty and hunger they discovered there. They saw that, even before the drought, the sharecroppers and tenant farmers in the cotton belt had lived at near starvation levels. The farm workers survived on the same foods that had sustained the slaves: salt pork and cornbread seasoned with molasses, supplemented with rice and beans, greens and sweet potatoes, and whatever they could hunt or fish. Here you see this is a sharecropper's cabin I think in South Carolina, and right here, these three buckets, the one in front say American Sunrise Pure Lard. Lard and salt pork was like the only cooking fat and was one of the pillars of this diet. After the drought killed their crops, the larders of their shotgun shacks emptied out. Children grew gaunt, and both young and old began to show signs of pellagra and rickets, malnutrition diseases that had long plagued the region. Up in the coal mining towns of Appalachia, workers and their families lived on the same salt pork and cornbread diet, and whatever they could afford at the company store. If they went on strike, which was often, they starved. Newspaper reporters wrote searing exposés of the conditions they found in these towns. And more importantly, they traveled with photographers. It was easy to discount words, but a lot harder to ignore pictures of hungry children. To help drought-stricken Southerners, President Hoover enlisted the help of the Red Cross, the quasi-governmental agency tasked with leading disaster relief efforts. This is Hoover here on the right with, with John Barton Payne, who was the rather dour head of the Red Cross at the time. The Red Cross workers gave seeds to Southern farmers so they could replant their crops. This man here is holding a box of garden seed here with the Red Cross on it. And most of the garden seed was actually turnip seeds. And after a while, after the turnips grew and they got the harvest, people grew very sick of eating turnips, which they called Hoover apples. And grudgingly, and only for a short time, the Red Cross also gave the workers boxes of relief food for their hungry families. Critics, however, pointed out how inadequate was the Red Cross's work. Millions of Americans were out of work. Between 1930 and 1932, the unemployment rate rose from 10% to 25%, the highest it has ever been. The streets of every city and town teemed with idle, worn-out men trying to bum the price of a cup of coffee and a donut. Couldn't the Red Cross or the federal government do something? The Red Cross refused. Its mission was limited to relief for natural disasters. Economic disasters would have to be handled by someone else. President Hoover said that it wouldn't be Washington, citing what he called one of the basic principles of Americanism. My own conviction is strongly that if we break down this sense of responsibility, of individual generosity to individual and mutual self-help in this country in times of national difficulty, and if we start appropriations of this character, we have not only impaired something infinitely valuable in the life of the American people, but have struck at the roots of government. And things weren't that bad, he insisted. After all, no one has starved. Hoover was wrong. New York social workers knew that in the city alone, 20 people died of starvation in 1931, and another 95 were admitted to hospitals near death from lack of food, but had been saved. This young lady is a daughter of farm workers I believe, in the Texas Panhandle. And they haven't had much to eat, and she became sick. And because of the lack of nourishment, she was not doing well. And they just stopped by the side of the road and just sort of waited, the family waited to see if she would get better or not. And, because they didn't have any money, they had no access to medical care. So it was just, we just had to see if she would survive. The lack of food probably killed thousands of Americans during the Depression decade, while many more suffered and even died from malnutrition diseases. But newspapers didn't publish those stories because they diverged too much from what their readers thought their country was supposed to be. It was harder to avoid the stark reality of America's economic plight when the bonus army arrived in Washington in the summer of 1932. These were World War I veterans, war heroes, who had lost their jobs and marched from cities and towns across the United States to the Capitol to ask the federal government to pay them the bonus they had been promised for their service. They were also obviously malnourished, dependent on handouts from strangers. President Hoover and Congress refused to help them and told the Army to clear them out. Using tanks and bayonets and tear gas, General Douglas MacArthur drove the veterans out of Washington. The American people watched the newsreel images and were disgusted. They saw the divide between their lives and the political rhetoric coming from Washington and wanted change. They found it in a candidate who projected optimism, who stated that this nation owes a positive duty that no one shall be permitted to starve, and promised that if charities and local governments couldn't feed the hungry, the federal government would step into the breach. Roosevelt won the 1932 elections by a landslide and quickly began reshaping Washington. Breaking with over a century of tradition, he decreed that it was the federal government's duty to help its citizens in times of great national need. One of his first initiatives was feeding the hungry. He had shown how this could be done as governor. Jane will explain a little bit more about this later, and how he wanted to expand this work nationally. The program was called FARA, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, led by Harry Hopkins, a New York social worker with a genius for organization. The ink was barely dry in the FARA Act before Hopkins began signing checks sending money to the states. State and local governments would distribute this relief, but all of it would be closely regulated by FARA officials back in Washington. Every week, FARA clients received pink vouchers listing the foods which they could receive. Voucher in hand, they went to the local grocery store, where the grocer filled the food order and then would be reimbursed by the local relief agency. Formulated based on the cutting edge of nutritional knowledge at the time, the relief order was designed to give the unemployed just the irreducible minimum of nutrients. In other words, it was only meant to sustain health for a short amount of time. That meant mostly flour, milk, bread, and potatoes. Aside from salt, no seasoning such as vinegar or mustard was allowed. The thinking was that if the food was too flavorful, relief clients would become satisfied and less likely to look for work. Not everyone was happy to receive these handouts, even though they needed the food. Many felt degraded by the necessity. "Once you've accepted the hospitality of the nation," said one relief client, "the steps downward seem to be greased. I wonder at what point of his descent it appears natural to a man to pick up a cigar stump from the gutter." In the fall of 1933, the unemployed received a welcome boost to this relief menu. The United States Department of Agriculture decided to tackle the perennial problem of farm overproduction by buying up excess wheat, pigs, and the like. At first, they simply destroyed the surplus, but bad publicity over thousands of pigs being slaughtered while millions of Americans went hungry was so negative that Roosevelt changed course. The Federal Surplus Relief Corporation, also headed by Harry Hopkins, was founded to distribute foods to FARA clients, beginning with 6-pound blocks of salt pork. Here you see, this is one of those blocks of salt pork, along with a handy sheet of recipes from the Bureau of Home Economics. Here it says how to cook salt pork. And these are all these recipes, the different recipes, including chowders, Spanish rice, salt pork stew, are designed to show how the notoriously unhealthy ingredient like salt pork could be prepared in a healthy way. Other foods soon entered the relief pipeline, though clients were never sure from one week to the next what their boxes would contain. This is a typical relief box, and here you have canned tomatoes, coffee, some kind of vegetable shortening, condensed milk, and this is probably flour and cornmeal over here. One of the frequent staples in these relief boxes was canned beef that had been salted and preserved in FARA-administered factories. The meat was from herds of cattle that were slowly dying in the drought-stricken plains and had been purchased by the government to help ranchers. Relief clients weren't in a position to complain. Federal food handouts kept America's millions of unemployed from suffering malnutrition diseases and even starvation for 2.5 years. Then at the end of 1935, President Roosevelt abruptly brought them to an end. Harry Hopkins had been keeping a close eye on the morale of the unemployed across the country. After the initial elation over receiving the boxes died down, the unemployed now displayed an alarming condition, vaguely defined as dependency. That is, many had stopped looking for work and were now content to simply stay at home and live off relief. There was also political calculation involved. Roosevelt needed to deflect conservative pushback against New Deal programs and improve his chances for the impending 1936 election. I think FDR may have also suffered from a bit of compassion fatigue. He had discovered that no matter how much food he gave to the unemployed, they always wanted more. In his 1935 State of the Union address, the president announced the end of food handouts, declaring that continued dependence on relief induces a spiritual and moral disintegration fundamentally destructive to the national fiber. It is in violation of the traditions of America. Herbert Hoover would have been comfortable with those words. And ironically, they brought on another period of hunger and malnutrition that harkened back to the worst days of the early 1930s. FDR was gambling that the economy would continue its slow recovery. The unemployment rate had declined to 15%, while business was picking up. In fact, Roosevelt was so optimistic that he also ordered wide cuts in federal spending. Unfortunately, it turned out that federal spending had floated the recovery, and thus began 3 years of what was called the Roosevelt recession. As businesses slashed payrolls, bread lines reappeared in cities like Chicago and Cleveland. This is a Cleveland neighborhood, and the city of Cleveland, which then was the only organization which had any money to hand out relief food, was giving people potatoes. And as you see, they're lined up, and they're bringing like kids' wagons, baby carriages, boxes, anything that they could, scrounge up to take the potatoes home. Aside from New York State and a few other areas, most communities were loath to make up the deficit in federal relief spending. Men scrounged on garbage dumps, while families tried to figure out how to survive on meager and irregular handouts of flour, potatoes, and occasionally fresh fruit. Hundreds of thousands of Americans showed signs of malnutrition disorders during these years, and social workers once again reported cases of starvation. The president was very aware of the dire situation. However, he had decided that what they needed was not food, but jobs. He would help them through the new Works Progress Administration, which embarked on a massive public works program. Unfortunately, WPA wages were low, not enough for a family of 4 to live on, and the number of jobs never enough. Bit by bit, Roosevelt and Hopkins grudgingly reopened the pipeline of relief food. First, they increased spending for the WPA's school lunch program. That they could justify because it gave jobs to women. Then in 1939, the federal government started the food stamp program. This is a family receiving the first boxes of food for food stamps in Los Angeles. That was acceptable because farmers were again producing more than the market could absorb, so the USDA bought their excess butter, pork, peas, and the like and gave them to the unemployed. The Roosevelt administration certainly would have been forced to do more, but it was saved from further compromising its principles by the outbreak of the European War. As part of a massive rearmament plan, the federal government built vast weapon plants on both coasts and in the industrial heartland. The economy boomed, while the unemployment rate dropped below 10% by early 1941. Americans had jobs and food. Needing every dollar for the war effort, in 1943, Roosevelt ended the food stamp program. Hunger had finally been eradicated. But the memory of the Depression decade, vividly depicted in those photographs of bread lines, of long lines of hollow-eyed men in shabby coats waiting for some watery stew and coffee, has remained with us ever since. And Jane will tell you the rest of the story.
That's actually the first time I heard Andy's talk, and I realized that I agree with a lot of what you said. Okay, let's see. Yeah, I do need a light. That's exactly what I need. As it turns out, one of the Depression's most recognizable symbols, bread lines like the one we see here, did not originate with the Depression. Bread lines, in fact, had been operating in the United States since the late 19th century, most of them concentrated down on the Bowery in New York, where they catered to drifters and alcoholics and other sort of fringe characters. Well, that changed in 1930 as bread lines began to attract a new clientele. Suddenly mixed in with all the sort of Bowery types were solid members of the working class, family men who had lost their jobs and were mortified by the idea that they had to resort to charity. Even more surprising, however, the bread lines were now attracting middle class and white-collar New Yorkers. These were unemployed businessmen and attorneys and architects and doctors. In short, people who had never experienced hunger. By the end of 1931, New York had over 80 bread lines feeding close to 200,000 people. Now, not only on the Bowery, but spread throughout the city. There were bread lines on Fifth Avenue. As the economy deteriorated and the number of hungry Americans soared, a group of women who called themselves home economists became the front line in America's fight against malnutrition. Their immediate goal was saving lives. At the same time, their specialized knowledge of food and nutrition had never been more relevant, and home economists welcomed the chance to assert their influence and modernize American eating habits. The story of how these women came to power begins at the turn of the century, during the heyday of the Progressive Era, the same period that gave us social reformers like Upton Sinclair and Jane Addams and Jacob Riis. In its original incarnation, home economics was a progressive reform movement started by women who believed that homemaking should be treated as a legitimate profession on the same level as medicine or engineering. To make that transition from amateur to professional, homemakers would receive rigorous training in the science of keeping house. Girls would take classes in chemistry, biology, bacteriology, and most importantly, nutrition. Here in these classes, in the classrooms, they would learn about the chemical composition of food and how it could be measured in units of energy or calories, knowledge that would replace the folk wisdom that women had depended on for generations. Newly enlightened, homemakers would be delivered from the mindless drudgery of cooking. They would find new satisfaction in their work, their status would rise, and their families would be properly fed. The home economics attitude toward food grew out of the same culture that gave us the temperance movement. And we see here two representatives of the Temperance League who seem in need of a stiff drink. There was, in fact, a lot of overlap between the temperance ladies and the home economics ladies. Taking a page from their temperance sisters, home economists believed that pleasure while eating led to what they thought of as food intemperance, a condition they hoped to prevent by developing a cooking style that avoided sensory stimulation. Home economists preferred mild flavors, no garlic, few spices, above all, no condiments. This is something Andy alluded to, no vinegars or mustards or ketchups, which were permissible only for the sick, for invalids who needed sort of a pickup, who had these feeble appetites and needed the condiments to sort of spur their eating. Unnecessary variety was also frowned on, and so were overly rich ingredients that only stimulated food desires. Food should be just palatable enough to stimulate the gastric juices that helped digestion, and they were very much concerned with the mechanics of digestion. So pleasure did have some functional value. But once that pleasure threshold was met, it became a liability, leading us to overindulgence. So lurking behind the science, you see these terrible fears about our carnal appetites. And those fears, I would argue, really helped shape the science. The founder of nutrition science here in the United States was Wilbur Atwater, a chemist who established America's first dietary standards. In 1895, working under the auspices of the USDA, Atwater began the systematic analysis of hundreds of basic American foods, including corn, turkey, and apple pie, to determine their chemical composition, research that helped him determine the food groups. So that would mean the carbohydrates, the proteins, and fats. This is when all of that is being discovered. Alongside his laboratory work, however, he conducted a series of very interesting nutritional surveys that were directed at poor and working class Americans to see what and how they were eating. Among his findings was, number one, American workers were eating the wrong foods and they were eating too much of them. And number two, they were allotting too much of their meager wages to food, which meant they were depriving themselves of other necessities. The result, according to Atwater, was a discontented and therefore a volatile workforce. So here again, you see how the science was framed by these larger cultural and economic concerns. Atwater's solution to overspending was for workers to cut back on what he considered luxury items, and that included eggs, butter, fresh vegetables, and fresh fruit, and replace them with nutritionally comparable foods like dried peas, dried fruit, tubers, and cornmeal. The next major advance in nutrition was the discovery of vitamins. The towering figure in vitamin research, oh dear. How did it happen? Yeah. Did I do something?
I'm not sure.
It wasn't me.
Is this close?
That's real close, real close.
Sorry about that.
That's not a problem, not a problem. You march on. This is McCollum. The next major advance in nutrition came at the hands of this guy here, Albert McCollum, the towering figure in vitamin research. He was a biochemist and one of the first scientists to use rats as laboratory test subjects. McCollum was instrumental to the discovery of vitamins A, B, and D, which were concentrated in milk, eggs, liver, and leafy green vegetables. So these are the same foods. You'll remember that Atwater thought people should do without, and which became known as the protective foods because they protected the body from deficiency diseases. Oh, no. Oh. They protected the body from deficiency diseases like scurvy and pellagra and rickets. Home economists were very much a part of early nutrition research. They worked for both Atwater and McCollum as laboratory assistants and then applied what they learned to their own studies. More generally, home economists translated scientific advances into concrete terms concrete and accessible terms, and then broadcast them to the general public. Home economists found teaching positions at state-funded agricultural colleges, where they established programs for rural homemakers. In East Coast cities, they started private cooking schools, including the Boston Cooking School, which opened in 1879. One of its instructors was a woman named Ellen Richards. She was the first woman to graduate from MIT and America's first female chemist. So you can see how Home Economist was providing a kind of side door to women interested in academia and interested in the hard sciences. They wanted to practice science, and the only way they could do that was through the science of homemaking. So you could say that Ellen Richards was one of the early stars of the home economics movement. Fanny Farmer was another. But home economics as a movement really came into its own during World War I. This is when America entered the war in 1917, the federal government began a campaign to convince citizens to cut back on consumption of everyday items like beef, butter, and flour. In a massive educational drive, home economists stepped in and showed women how to observe the new food restrictions while cooking healthy, well-balanced meals for the family. It wasn't until the 1930s, however, that Americans really developed what one home economist called nutrition consciousness. One of the first places that happened was in New York. In the fall of 1930, New York public schools began to notice really unusual attendance patterns. Children were missing school in large numbers and for longer periods of time, and they didn't know why. So they sent out truant officers to round up these wayward kids, bring them back to school. But what they found when they came to the homes of these children were kids that were too weak to get out of bed. Mothers watched while their kids lost weight and grew listless, and as children grew weaker, resistance went down, rates of illness went up. Mothers who once had no reason to worry about their children's diet now felt that knowledge of things like vitamins and minerals and calories was critical to their well-being. So to give you a sense, but they knew that the knowledge was important, but it was all mysterious to them. This was not part of the sort of the intellectual fabric of the United States. They were filled with questions. To give you a sense of the kinds of questions they were asking, I would like to read a short excerpt to you from a rural homemaker, and it was written to the home economics department at Cornell. And this is what the woman would like to know. And this is how I imagine her, a rural homemaker from upstate New York. I do not understand calories or vitamins, just what they are. I understand foods change when taken into the stomach, but what I want to know is this: what foods go together? What is the difference in the stomach if coffee is mixed with milk before drinking, or a cup of black coffee and a glass of milk taken separately? I have 7 children. They're at home, and I'm continually studying what to feed them for the best results. Milk, I understand, is the best food, but does it not sometimes change to a harmful food with certain conditions of the stomach? There is so much I do not understand. As the economy deteriorated, it became clear to the governor of New York, Franklin Roosevelt, that stopgap measures like the bread lines were no longer enough. And in 1931, he created the first state-sponsored food welfare program. It was called TERRA, that's the acronym, the Temporary Emergency Relief Administration. On one hand, TERRA was revolutionary. The idea that government should provide food relief had never been imagined on a scale like this. And the method for calculating food rations was revolutionary too. Unlike past attempts, TERRA would use the latest science to calculate each family's precise nutritional needs. On the other hand, TERRA's policies were indebted to a much older way of thinking. In a culture like ours that values independence and the idea of self-sufficiency, it was important to administrators that TERRA preserve the American work ethic. So home economists at TERRA formulated rations that would be, and this is their language, that would be adequate to prevent physical suffering and maintain a minimal living standard. Anything more than that, it was decided, would destroy the incentive to find a job. So along with mustard and vinegar and the other condiments, having the quantity of food that was just a little more than you needed was enough to destroy one's sense of pride and lead you to sort of throw out the job wanted section of the newspaper. Oh, I'm so sorry. Next slide. So home economists at TERRA formulated rations that would be adequate to prevent physical suffering, maintain a middle living standard. Anything more than that was decided. Sorry. What that translated into was a diet heavy on bread and potatoes for calories, combined with cheap vitamin-rich foods like cabbage, carrots, canned tomatoes, beans, and most importantly, milk. Up to 25 quarts of milk a week for the average family of 5. For homemakers, the question became what to do with all of that milk. Like many an answer came from a home economist named Flora Rose, and she's seated in the middle with the white hair. Like many home economists, Rose came from a wealthy family, but had rejected traditional upper-class life. As a woman in her 20s, instead of getting married, she went to college and earned a BS and then an MA in nutrition from Columbia. And in 1907, she founded a department of home economics at Cornell. During World War I, Rose became deputy director of the New York State Food Administration. So by the time the Depression came along, she had a depth of experience in the area of food relief. And in 1932, she was contacted by Terra to create a series of Depression menus and recipes. And you can see here an example of one of her recipes. You can see the really prominent position of milk, which is part of every meal. It's cooked into the foods, and it's also drunk as a beverage. You also see tomato juice. It was a really important source of vitamin C during the Depression when fresh fruits were too expensive. And you'll notice there's no meat or eggs, which were simply beyond the means of the Terra recipient. So looking at these menus, you really see the hallmarks of home economics cooking. From the start of the movement, home economists were partial to New England cooking. They loved chowders, baked beans, all kinds of scallop dishes, and a wide variety of puddings. But if home economics had one defining food, it would have to be white sauce. A simple bechamel made from some form of fat, flour, and milk. White sauce was poured over fish, poultry, and vegetables. It was used as a thickener in sauces and a binder in casseroles. It was the cream in creamed cod, creamed chicken, and creamed tongue. Flora Rose gave us recipes for all sorts of cream dishes, all of these, including eggs in a white sauce, and cabbage in white sauce, parsnips in white sauce. But her most creative application was, I think, spaghetti and carrots in white sauce, which was one of the dishes that we cooked in our own kitchen. And I'm telling you, it's not as bad as it sounds. It's a lot like if you're familiar with a Jewish noodle kugel. So that was the wasp kugel. One last thing you should know about Rose. Like many home economists, she was an activist who supported a variety of progressive causes and organizations, including the League of Women Voters. And it was in that context that she encountered another social reformer, a young woman by the name of Eleanor Roosevelt. The two women met in the 1920s, and they became good friends. Rose and her partner, Martha Van Rensselaer, spent time at the Roosevelt's home in Hyde Park, and Eleanor and her husband made yearly pilgrimages to Cornell. So this relationship between Martha Van Rensselaer and Rose and the Roosevelts becomes very important, as we will see in a minute, in the food history of the Depression. As evidence for malnutrition grew, home economists across the country swung into action. Their central command, so to speak, was a federal agency in DC called the Bureau of Home Economics, a branch of the Department of Agriculture and the country's single largest employer of women scientists. Its chief was Louise Stanley, a chemist who had received her PhD at Yale and who led the Bureau for over 2 decades. The Bureau was founded in 1923 as a kind of homemaking research center focused on cooking, cleaning, and sewing. But during the Depression, it put its regular work on hold to come up with a low-cost emergency diet that people could follow just for a short while until the economy rebounded. So in 1931, the Bureau launched a nationwide educational campaign, printing up millions of dietary guides and distributing to schools, churches, and other institutions. These guides told people what to eat, but they've also functioned as sort of nutrition textbooks, explaining the food groups, the kinds of nutrients that you could find in each of the food groups, and how they come together to form a balanced diet. This is an example of one of the guides, and you can see, just looking at the language, beginning with "spend your food money wisely." It's particularly pertinent when incomes are reduced and there is little money to spend. Many families have lower incomes than ever before from which to make all necessary expenditures. So there was very much a sense of urgency that was sort of part of the culinary, the food education campaign. Nutrition in the 1930s was indeed an emotionally fraught subject. Dietary guides came with warnings that poor food habits in childhood could handicap a person for life. Dietary guides, especially vitamins, were especially concerning, and more than anything else, women were afraid of the hidden hunger caused by undetected vitamin deficiencies, which would cause their kids to have night blindness and soft bones. Reassurance came from a fictional radio character invented by the Bureau of Home Economics named Aunt Sammy. An American every woman, Aunt Sammy came on the radio once a day on over 100 radio stations across the United States. So when it came to vitamins, this very sort of mysterious and intimidating subject matter, Aunt Sammy told listeners, most of us who follow a simple but varied diet and are without food prejudices, she was very big on this idea of dispensing with our food prejudices, get our supply of vitamins whether we like it or not. Simple. Of course, she then goes on to explain what vitamins do and why we need them. So she manages to sneak in her lesson, but in this very sort of folksy and approachable way. This is an example of an Aunt Sammy script. This is all material that was generated by the Information Office at the Bureau of Home Economics and sent out to radio stations across the country where local Aunt Sammys, there was an Aunt Sammy in every town, would deliver the news and give her advice, always sort of in the local dialect. An important part of Aunt Sammy's mission was to get women to cook with the low-status budget ingredients that no one really liked too much. For every ingredient she championed, Aunt Sammy gave out recipes, first over the air and then sent out as pamphlets, and finally compiled into a best-selling cookbook that brought home economics into millions of homes. One of the ingredients she championed was something that people would eat today, whole wheat kernels. This was a food at the time that women would have associated with animal feed. But again, it was time to sort of dispense with our prejudices. And here she's giving us a rather interesting recipe for a whole wheat chowder seasoned with salt pork. Information about nutrition flowed through many channels. One of its most influential was the First Lady of the United States. Like other progressive women, Eleanor Roosevelt saw home economics as deliverance from the drudgery of housekeeping. But if home economics was good for women, it was also good for America. In the midst of a national crisis, the woman who adopted a scientific diet guided her family's health and by extension that of the nation when it was most at risk. To eat scientifically was therefore an act of patriotism. To inspire women and set an example, as the new First Lady, Eleanor brought scientific cooking into the White House. For advice about what to serve, she turned to her old friend Flora Rose and adopted Rose's Depression menus to give to her own family. So these were the same menus that had been given to terror recipients, now being served on White House china. To publicize her cause, just 2 weeks after moving into the White House, she called in the press, and with great fanfare, she served the president a lunch of deviled eggs in tomato sauce with a side of mashed potatoes and for dessert, prune pudding and only 7.5 cents. So this is a great example of how we can economize. When reporters asked FDR what he thought of the meal, he answered, "It was good." But we know from White House memos that FDR was an enthusiastic gourmet and was deeply unhappy with Eleanor's budget cooking. Lucky for Eleanor, she was someone who just didn't really care about the sensory experience of eating. Her relationship with food was really utilitarian. Food was a necessary way of delivering nutrients, and plain utilitarian food like beans and potatoes served the purpose, as well as duck à l'orange and filet mignon. But the Depression's ultimate utility food was a line of fortified breakfast cereals developed by Flora Rose. Milk Weedo, Milk Odo, and MILKORNO represented the pinnacle of scientific eating. These were foods engineered in the laboratory, each based on a formula of 2/3 ground grain to 1/3 powdered skim milk. They were high in nutrients, they were inexpensive and non-perishable. They could be eaten alone, but with no defining flavor. They could also be baked into muffins and stirred into chowders and mixed into meatloaf. Their uses were infinite. MILKORNO was unveiled in 1933 at Cornell to a room full of distinguished guests, including Eleanor Roosevelt, who were fed a budget lunch of MILKORNO polenta with tomato sauce. Eleanor was smitten. In this newfangled cereal, she saw an example of American ingenuity, and female ingenuity in particular, and a product that could help feed millions of people. Eleanor put MILKORNO on the White House menu, and later that year, when the federal government began food distributions to the unemployed, MILKORNO was included in their rations, introducing millions of Americans to the country's earliest and perhaps the first fortified food. Food, like language, is always evolving, shaped by the same events that we learn about in history class: wars and famines, migrations, advances in technology and science are continuously shaping and then reshaping the way we eat. During the 1930s, home economists interrupted a typically organic process, and in one colossal push attempted to replace traditional foodways with a scientifically designed eating program. I've tried to show how culture crept into the science. The home economists' dietary recommendations were scientifically determined, but concerns over preservation of the work ethic were also part of their calculations. The idea that our food choices should be guided by science marked the beginning of a truly modern food sensibility. At the same time, looking at food through the lens of science helped us navigate our old nervousness about food and pleasure. Even more, it gave us a way to think about food that avoided reference to the sensory enjoyment of eating. Instead, we could focus on what could do for our bones and our muscles and our digestive system, how food could make us stronger, more impervious to disease. Finally, I just would like to make clear that I'm not bashing the science. The science was critical. It was very important, and it helped millions of people through these home economists to survive during very difficult times. So the next time you're in the supermarket and you find yourself reading nutritional labels, checking which box of cereal is lower in sugar and higher in fiber, you can think back to the women of the Great Depression, the home economists who worked so hard to enlighten us. oh, you're getting a mic.
Yeah, these women seem to be the hidden figures behind a great part of American history, just
Yes.
like the African American women were behind NASA. But the question I had was about one particular vignette. I think it was Martha Westfall and the
Martha
New
Van
York
Rensselaer.
Martha Van
education.
Rensselaer?
No,
No,
the
different?
shoes that were bought for the kids when they visited the home. They took the
Oh, by the truant officers.
yes. That was particularly interesting because it seemed like they were empowering themselves, the New York education, to take care of these kids.
Yeah, it was. I mean, a lot of the Depression in those early years were these sort of spontaneous responses by various city organizations like the police department or like public school teachers banding together and just coming up with something. So there was a lot of sort of innovative grassroots, I guess I would charity to sort of help fellow citizens make it through this tough time. I would agree with that.
In back there?
What were the social classes that actually absorbed these messages? I mean, I would find it surprising if the large Italian immigrant populations would have been following these kinds of prescriptions. I don't know whether there was much, you'll have to tell us whether there was much of an effort to penetrate among African Americans, both in the South and in the communities that were being established in the North during the First World War.
Oh my, it's such an interesting question. Sorry, continue.
And just one last piece. And was this a uniquely American phenomenon, or did one see similar movements arising in Britain, Germany, France, Italy, particularly as the economic crisis of the 30s?
Are you referring to the home economics movement?
The whole notion of nutritional advice from on high, and whether it made an impact, if there was one, in any of these other societies as well?
Well, I can answer part of the question, and maybe Andy, I hope you'll know some of it too. Yes, immigrants did receive federal food distributions. At the Tenement Museum, where I have the connection, there was an Italian family living in the building during the Great Depression who received a box from Terra that included ingredients that they didn't know what to do with, like oatmeal, something they had no use for. But often immigrants would would barter with each other. So you could give your oatmeal to the Irish neighbor down the hall, and they would give you your lentils. So they found ways to make it work. But they did also, it was also a way to introduce immigrants to American foods. It was partly because of these food distributions that the Baldizzi family developed a taste for American cheese. And there was some effort to cater to immigrant tastes. I know that in the food distributions in New York during Passover included matzah. So that was very nice of them. Now, about the African Americans, that's a really complicated story because the distributions made to African Americans were not of the same quality as those given to white Americans, on the basis that it's what they were used to. And so it was a, I don't know what else one could say here.
It was actually worse than that. It was not only. Well, I think I'm.
I don't think you are.
Oh. Well, it was so with the African Americans, it was not only were they given sort of substandard or subpar distributions, but they were also wouldn't receive the distributions unless they worked for it, unless they did work for like the town or the town or the city down south, because they thought if they got something for free, then they would become too demanding. And it was crucial for the way that the society worked at that time in the Jim Crow era South to keep them oppressed. And just on the question of immigrants and immigrant foods, I mean, one of the sort of things which we see as a kind of like a lost opportunity during the Great Depression was that they didn't look to the immigrants' own food cultures and food habits for clues on how to overcome the depression and overcome malnutrition, because a lot of these immigrants, Italians or Chinese and other peoples, came from cultures which had undergone periodic starvations and bouts of malnutrition for centuries. So they knew they had a whole, there were foods of poverty which they knew. And Italian immigrants in New York City during the Depression, and actually some would still do it today, would go to public parks and vacant lots and collect dandelion greens, which are of course very healthy. But the people who ran the home economics programs, the food distribution programs, mostly were absolutely not interested in incorporating those kinds of traditions. Because they were not only interested in feeding the people nutritious foods, but with the immigrants was Americanizing them and teaching them how to eat American. Yes, sir?
I noticed in all your pictures and most of your recipes that I don't need the microphone. That you can hear me. That milk is prevalent. Was milk a very good value in those days? And if so, in what forms was it prevalent? Powdered, condensed, or regular dairy?
Well, the second half of the question, what form was milk distributed? I mean, originally milk was of course liquid, and the problem with powdered and dried milk is that it went bad relatively easily. But then they developed ways of making it so it would last longer. I mean, milk was delivered either loose milk, like you would have to go with like a bucket or a can to a store which would distribute it, or to
Relative to other foods, was it a good value for
Well,
caloric and
I can say something to that. This isn't exactly an answer to your question, but it's the best I can do. Yes, it was a good value, but more than that, there was a kind of cult of milk. And it was considered a perfect food. So there were other good, foods of equal value. Lima beans were valuable too and economical, but milk had an aura about it that other foods did not, and this is something that had been building in American food culture since the end of the 19th century.
Well, just also one last thought about milk. Also, because milk was the world's most perfect food in that time, it was the focus of tremendous amounts of charity work. And there were many charitable programs to raise money for the Milk Fund, which was huge during the 1930s. So a lot of this milk was given out for free to school children.
I'm sure we could go on and on. This has been really fascinating. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.